I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the Mosaic of Wine Series 2. Giving my audience of wine lovers, students and professionals from around the world access to some of the most interesting, successful and influential people working in and around wine. We continue the series today in the company of Justin Howard-Sneyd, Master of Wine. Justin is based in London, from where he consults on the commercial side of wine to a wide range of clients, from producers to importers and restaurateurs, as well as making his own wine, Domain of the Bee, in the Roussillon region of the south of France. For the past 2 years, Justin has been exploring what grape growers can learn from the regenerative agriculture movement. He is also a trustee of the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. We begin today's episode hearing Justin's origin story via the International Wine Challenge, Fulham Road Wine Centre, a stint as a flying winemaker, as well as roles at Chapel Down and a career in supermarket buying. He takes us inside his experiences within the Regen community, discussing the longer-term goals he hopes to achieve, before taking a deep dive into how he gained his MW qualification and exploring his current consultancy role, before discussing storytelling and community building in wine, including his own Domain of the Bee wine club, before closing on opportunities for wine education. Enjoy.
Well, one of the joys of wine, as I probably experienced in lots of other conversations, is how influential the people who work in wine can be in the enjoyment of life in wine and deciding to work in wine in the first place. And that was certainly part of my experience. I suppose if wine probably starts for me at the International Wine Challenge, where I first worked as an assistant helping put the bottles on the table and clear them away again. And I met a lot of very nice people, the tasters, everyone was very friendly. And I was thinking, okay, this wine world seems to be rather good fun, rather nice people. I worked quite a bit with people like Robert Joseph, Charles Metcalfe, Simon Woods. They were in the early days of the Wine Challenge. And I actually came back and worked 2 or 3 times after that for the challenge, just for a couple of weeks. I took a busman's holiday from my job and went and did that. And it was actually chatting to people, tasters, fellow helpers at the Wine Challenge that, first of all, I learned a lot about wine, but secondly, made me think, okay, maybe this wine business is something I should stick around and do more of, and ended up applying for jobs in wine shops and got to work at the Fulham Road Wine Centre with Angela Muir, who's another very sort of important person in my wine career. She's a master of wine. She used to train MW students in the basement of the Fulham Road Wine Centre, and I used to sit there in the shop thinking, well, I'm never going to do that because it looks terrible. These poor guys with ashen faces on Saturday mornings come down with boxes of glasses and then come up looking drained and depleted 3 hours later after Angela had harangued them because of their poor answers. And I thought, well, I'm never doing the MW. But Angela was great, actually, and a great person to work for. And several times after that, when I actually moved on from the Fulham Road Wine Centre, I did a sort of stint of flying winemaking. Travelled around the world to Hungary, Romania, South Africa, a couple of times, France. And I worked, I think, twice for Angela on different projects where she was the sort of overseeing winemaking, blending consultant. So there is a lovely way in which the people you encounter along the way help you in one way or another, sometimes greatly, because and your career evolves in a way that you then encounter those people later on in life and maybe buy wine from them. And it's a lovely way in which paths crisscross a lot in the world of wine.
Yeah, it reminds me of a sticker, or I think I had it on my laptop for a little while. I picked up over in Australia, which just said, "Don't buy food from strangers," and it was sort of trying to promote the whole idea of getting to know your farmer and getting to know the person who is making your food. And I very much think there's a crossover with wine. I just think that I think we're very lucky in the world of wine that we get to know winemakers and have them pour for us, and all of these things that I think we're very lucky to be able to do. And I think we'd always prefer to buy wine and drink wine from people that we know, wouldn't we, really?
And people do stay in wine once they're in wine. It's in spite of the terrible salaries, the poor health, the bad hours, it's a very attractive world to be in. And sometimes you move from one side to another, from buying to selling, from making to buying, and you encounter people all the way along the way. Lots of people who used to sell me wine back in the day, I'm now communicating with for other reasons. I'm getting involved in the viticulture side and meeting different sets of people, but sometimes the same people thread through. And actually, it's building on that network of contacts that I found has been really impactful in my wine life.
Yeah, very cool. And I kind of purposely, didn't press you too much on the journey there, because I think there, and again, it came up in your questionnaire. I think that regenerative agriculture, it feels as though it will be a topic that we'll revisit, through today. But I think there's also a sort of almost, it felt like a separate kind of origin story for that, and how you kind of first got interested, and the people who again helped you, sparked your interest, and worked with you through that journey.
Well, funnily enough, that's a nice little segue to a story we didn't chat about. But Stephen Cronk is the founder of the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. And I first met him at the Fulham Road Wine Centre when I was working there for Angela. And I forget whether he was selling us wine. He came in a few times. And when I first started many years later with my own vineyard project, Stephen rang me up and said, "Hey, do you remember me? We used to meet each other at the Fulham Road Wine Centre. Can I come along? I've just started a rosé project. I want to come and have a chat." So he came with his video camera and, I don't know if it was an iPhone in those days, but he was shooting a series of videos with different people to try and post on his site to get people to know about Mirabeau. And that must have been, 20 years ago, because we bought the first vineyard block 21 years ago. And he is the guy who, some years later, having very successfully created the Mirabeau brand, decided that he wanted to have his own vineyard. So they, by that stage, had the resources to then buy a small domain. So Domain Mirabeau, they bought 5 or 6 years ago. And in the thinking around how to farm that, were very frustrated that first of all, they knew that organics was a direction they wanted to go in, but they'd seen lots of organic farms that weren't particularly thriving and where the soil wasn't particularly healthy. And they knew they wanted to do more. But he had real trouble finding out any information about how to farm for soil health. And he'd heard this concept of regenerative farming, but couldn't find much with relation to regenerative viticulture. And he found Mimi Castile online, and she's one of the growers who's been advocating for regenerative practices in vineyards for many years. And they got talking, and they agreed that they needed to start a foundation in order to promote the messages. And that would have been about 4 years ago now, 4 or 5 years. And so, that was Stephen's origin. And then a little bit later, he called me and said, would I like to become a trustee in order to help them grow and spread the word among the world's winemakers?
And could you kind of almost tie those back together for us in terms of the timeline then? So was that when you were still sort of making wine, or was it you'd already started your own project? How did that?
So there's a big gap between those two things: the Fulham Road days, and then when I was doing my own wine. So after Fulham Road, I spent 3 years making wine around the world. I then came back and actually got a job. Again, with a nice little coincidence. My mum lives around the corner from Chapel Down. So I'd worked with David Cowderoy, who worked for Angela, and he'd been the winemaker on some of the projects that I was working with for Angela. He was making wine at Chapel Down. I gave him a call, got a job to work there for a couple of months, just filtering wine in the winter. Got to know Stephen Skelton, who was also there, who I know quite well. And it was Stephen who said, "Oh, Safeway is looking for a buyer. Would you? Why don't you send your CV in?" So I literally sent one letter, sent my CV to the lovely Liz Robertson, Master of Wine, who was at Safeway at the time, and she decided that they needed a bit of winemaking and blending expertise in a team that was kind of quite commercial buying focused. And because I have the winemaking background, they thought I was a good fit, so they gave me a very junior buying job. That was just one job application, and that was just luck. So quite a lot of coincidence and luck involved in that. And that's how I started out as a supermarket buyer. I did 3 years with Safeway, 5 years with Sainsbury's. Alan Cheeseman was boosting the Sainsbury's team and hired me and Laura Jewell as 2 freshly minted MWs to join the Sainsbury's team. 5 happy years there, and then I went to work for Waitrose and headed the wine team in the end for Waitrose for about just coming up for 5 years. So that was kind of the commercial side of my wine life. But in the background all the time, I was keen to one day make my own wine. And what eventually led me to the Roussillon as a buyer for Sainsbury's. I think I'd gone out there as the Southern French buyer, and Charlie Sichel of the Sichel family in Bordeaux said, "Oh, you should come to go and visit our Bordeaux place. Come down to the south of France. We've got a place in the Corbière." And so I went to visit Domaine de Triol, and then drove over the hill from the Corbière into the Roussillon the next day and looked at the view and thought, my God, this is fantastic. And decided that if I was ever going to buy a parcel of vines, it was going to be somewhere like this. And a little bit later, I think the next year, Amanda and I went on holiday there, just fell in love with the region and tasted some incredible wines and met a couple of English guys who were making wine in the valley, and Richard Case and Mark Hoddy. And basically we said they just had a hailstorm. They'd lost 60% of their crop. They were financially slightly embarrassed because this was the first vintage and they were never going to make the money to cover the costs of the farming. So we said, look, if you find a vineyard for sale, we could buy it, and then you could take those grapes and make more wine in the next few years. So we had a very low barrier to entry into vineyard ownership, because all the farming and all the difficult things were done by Richard and Mark at the beginning. And only a few years later did we decide, now we're ready to actually have our own wine brand and have the wine made for us. So that's how the Domain of the Bee first started.
I love it. And as you say as well, I mean, it's incredible. Again, there's so many sort of elements coming together. But it was the kind of being a Domain of the Bee was the way that they'd been managing the vineyards there. Did that tie in with the regenerative angle, or was that sort of something that sort of developed later?
In one respect, and sort of accidentally, yes. So these are all. So we bought one vineyard block that was very, very old. I think we were told it was nearly 90 when we bought it. So we now tell people it's over 100, but the maths is hard to. It's hard to know exactly when it was planted, because sometimes the paperwork doesn't go back that far. No one actually knows when it was planted. The main aspect in which that kind of vineyard makes it hard to farm conventionally is that you can't drive tractors between the vines, because the vines are too close together. So there was no ploughing and no tillage. And so one of the key features of regenerative growing is not to till the soil, or to till as little as possible. But in no other respect really was the farming that we practiced at the beginning. I mean, it was very low intervention, but we definitely needed various forms of treatment in order to prevent some of the diseases around there. And so we're not organic. We haven't been organic, but we only would try and use things as little as possible. And the farming we're now doing with Jean-Marc Lafarge is all certified HVE3, which is the highest sustainability certification in France. And Jean-Marc's practicing quite a lot of organic and regenerative farming in various parts of his plots. And we're starting to debate how we can improve the farming at Domain of the Bee and make it more regenerative. But there are obstacles, and financial obstacles, and yield obstacles as well, because the yields are really, really low. And therefore, if your farming cost doubles, suddenly your cost per grape becomes pretty enormous. And so I'm at the moment going through a transition period, working with Jean-Marc and his team to work out what we can do to improve our viticulture. And very sadly, we actually pulled out that vineyard that we bought 20 years ago, because the yield has got so low and the vines were really on their last legs. And then we've just had the third year of a very serious drought in the Roussillon. And that had just pushed some of the vineyards over the edge. What I'm now working on or thinking about is how to replant that vineyard, and how to do that, deploying as many regenerative practices as possible to try and have a model vineyard that people can follow and follow the trials and tribulations of trying to start out from scratch planting a vineyard that's going to last another 100 years. Yeah,
this is the amazing thing, isn't it, about vineyards, and I guess about other elements of farming, but that sort of succession where, as you say, you're as soon as you plant and you kind of start the life of the vineyard, then there's always change over time, and there's a pretty much I guess with a few small exceptions, that there's a finite amount of time in which it's sort of economically viable to have the vineyard going.
And typically in lots of parts of the world, people will pull a vineyard out at 35 or 40 years old and replant it, whereas lots of Europe, there are these lovely old vineyards. And just something I like to consider sometimes, if you look at an old vine, every little kink in the trunk as the heads sort of grow up from the ground, from the graft, every single pruning cut is like a 100-year-old sculpture that 100 people have made a cut once a year and created this sculpture. And you do think about those people. Who were they? Yeah. Was it the vigneron who owned it, or was it a crew of pruners who just came in and did it? For how many years was the pruning done in this style, and then when did it change? And how's that vine, what's it seen over its life? It's been quite a thing to consider. It's quite emotional, unfortunately, when we pulled the vineyard out, just realising that these noble plants that have been serving us so well for so long, I mean, let's face it, lots of them had died, and lots of gaps in the vineyard, lots of unhealthy vines. But then every 10th vine or so would be a beautiful old healthy vine with 5 heads, producing 15 bunches of grapes quite happily each year. And you think, what a terrible shame. I wanted to just leave the healthy vines and just, but that just isn't economic to try and farm vines scattered around a field. So we had to pull the whole thing out.
Yeah, with your description there, my mind went immediately to an area of Spain that I absolutely love, which is the Sierra de Gredos. And the same, I've so many times I've been, proudly taken to the vineyard and shown around the most recent time, sort of June or so last year. And then, as you say, if you try to sort of visualize this sort of perfectly interplanted vineyard, then you're in the wrong place, because there are so many gaps, there are so many bits missing, but that is just really showing its age, and that is one region of many that are just prized for their old vines. I think they've got something like the average age is upwards of sort of 60, 70 years old. So you're going to find that.
Yeah, they're still there because no one had the economic resources to replant their vineyard, and they just limped along with increasing the aging vines without doing a huge amount of work in the vineyards. They managed to produce a crop that they could sell for some money. And it's only recently that those places have been rehabilitated, and the quality of the grapes has been recognized for what it can be. And some of those Gredos wines are superb. Great examples of with Grenache growers as well. Old vine Grenache from those kind of vineyards can taste absolutely fabulous. And the wine that we came from the vineyard that we pulled out, it's a wine we call Regenerative, had been getting some incredibly high scores from tasters and from competitions. We got a 97 out of 100 and best Grenache in a Grenache competition of the world, actually equal best Grenache with an Australian one. So, knowing that those vines can produce that is fantastic. But the yields were down to 5 to 8 hectolitres a hectare. So 500 litres per hectare. And when you're farming a whole hectare and just getting 500 litres from it, it doesn't really stack up. And it's not a great use of the world's resources. So we hopefully will be able to replant with a younger vineyard that will have the same quality potential, but produce 5 times, 6 times the amount.
Yeah, I love it. And, as kind of move us towards thinking slightly more on the culture side of things. It's great being able to sort of make comparisons between, somebody I know that you're a friend of, Abby Rose, who was a guest in the previous series. And I still remember her talking about, when she was kind of starting out, resources and I guess connectivity and knowledge was still very, very scarce on the ground, a little bit like you've described there for Stephen. And I'm just curious, I think almost, your current project will give us a really cool insight into how things are now, because presumably, building on all of those initiatives, and I know some of the sort of online initiatives that Abby has been involved with. Presumably now, when you step into a new project like that, and with the goals that you have for that, you now have a much richer knowledge base and a kind of contact base to draw upon.
Definitely. Well, look, I think one of the things I've most enjoyed about my engagement with the regenerative world in the last 5 years has been the community of people and the knowledge sharing and the personal warmth and friendship and encouragement. And Abby is one of the people I met fairly early on in that journey, who I just thought embodied a fantastic way of thinking about the world, so deeply caring about certain values, but actually also she's a real doer, and she just gets on and builds things and creates things that are of use. So she has an app called Sector Mentor and a wider platform called Soil Mentor, which helps you understand how your soil health is performing and how to improve it. But she did that because she built a model for herself and her parents farm vines and other things in Chile. And she wanted a tool to help them track the progress of their farming. And so she built it for herself and then thought other people can benefit from this. But I found her and many other people in the regenerative world. So if you go to, so it's probably fair to say that Regen, short for regenerative, is much more established in agriculture than it is in viticulture. And so when I first went to Groundswell, which is the regenerative farming festival, happens in June, it's known as the Glastonbury of farming, because you go and camp and then there's music in the evenings and you sit on the hay bale and drink cider and listen to music. And then there's 2 days of really fascinating talks, demonstrations, and people meeting and talking. And it's essentially farmers with perhaps nowadays 20 or 30 people who've got knowledge about vineyards who are also there, and an increasing number of grape growers coming along to learn about Regen. But it is a very, very interesting community of people who are all believers in something that They want to share. They're not jealously guarding knowledge. They're sharing knowledge and encouraging each other. And that is something I think that's quite typical in the wine world. But I've found it kind of reinforced by everything I've learned about regenerative culture.
Yeah, and I presume it's having that bigger goal almost to kind of tie everything together, and I guess bonding not just on what you're doing, bottling wine and selling wine, and all the things that all producers will have to face, but sometimes not necessarily making it easy for yourself, or not necessarily taking the easiest path because you've got that additional bigger goal around, I guess, leaving the place better than when you
found it. Exactly. So the concept of regeneration is trying to bring life back to something that has had some life in the past, but that you can reinvigorate. And essentially, you are trying to leave. So very briefly, if you talk about sustainability as a concept is great, but the idea is that you don't keep degrading the landscape of the land. You just keep it at the level it's reached. But the idea of regeneration is that you build it back. And that's a very forward-thinking, future-thinking way to go about things. And it means that the purpose of your entity is not just to make profit or to have a nice lifestyle. It's actually to try and make the world a better place and to make the little bit of the world that you look after a better place to be. And that's essentially quite a generous thing to try and do, and actually a very difficult thing to try and do, as well as sustaining a profitable business. What regenerators would call extractive farming is where you just flog your soil and you put fertilizer on and you try and push the yield to get as much as you can get to sell a commodity at the highest price you can get it for. But eventually you deplete your land to the extent where there's no fertility left in the soil and it starts to erode and blow away. But regeneration is about slowly building that bank of soil health back, so that you actually have land that you can hand on to the next generation and can be farmed in that way for a long period. So we want viticulture. So the excitement I've found in my life is that various different things that I do have come together and united behind a purpose. And I think that if we can somehow get grape growers in the next 15, 20 years to shift so that the majority are practicing a regenerative form of farming, so their soil health is getting better and their biodiversity is better and they're not quite so monocultural and they have hedgerows and they have trees and they have birds and the community around them benefits from their economic activities, then we'll have a better future for the world of wine. And if what you do in your life is acting to just sort of serve you and your family, then that's all very well. But if you can do something that also helps improve the world, then it's immensely energizing. And something I felt greatly in the last few years is a kind of a sense of purpose and a sense of mission to try and make that happen. Yeah,
and I think probably knowing where the conversation was heading, I think really where I would lead us to is around expertise, and I think that this is where I think we can really unpack something that I liked and stayed with me when we first spoke. Justin, was you're as an individual now you're in a place where you're being sort of referred to others, and there are conversations taking place, and they say, oh, you should speak to Justin about that. And I think it's worth doing a little segue in the journey as well into how you gaining your Master of Wine, because I think that is of course an incredible network and an incredible title to have, but presumably as well as everything that we've spoken about on the Regen side, it also brings in some hard skills as well, and some analytical skills which can make, I think, all of this able to be put onto a spreadsheet or a presentation and kind of demonstrating the benefits of this.
Yes, I mean, I think first of all, the MW training takes you to a level above what the diploma quite rightly focuses on, which is learning really a lot of the facts, so that you feel you've got a really good knowledge base to go on from. But the MW doesn't really test deeper knowledge or more. It tests deeper knowledge. It doesn't test more knowledge. It's not about more facts. Mm-hmm. It's much about interpretation and understanding of the whole rather than the narrow. And yes, it does sometimes ask you a question about the narrow, but there's also papers towards the end, papers 4 and paper 5, that are much more holistic. And I suppose if I have any kind of special natural attribute, it's to think about the whole of something rather than about breaking it down into its constituent parts. And I've very excitedly recently learned a term that I think quite nicely describes the way I think I've always thought, which is systems thinking. So I haven't actually yet put systems thinker on my LinkedIn profile because I haven't completely got to the bottom of what I would need to claim to be able to claim to be a systems thinker. But I think thinking about things as an entity in their holistic self is a much better way than trying to be too reductionist. And particularly if you run a business, you may have certain issues in certain parts of it, and you can get an expert to come and look at the specific issue of soil health in your vineyard, and they'll tell you that you have to do this one thing to solve that problem. Or you can look at a finance expert to tell you about your retention rate and your customer base or whatever, and they will look at little parts and they give you a diagnosis. It's a bit like modern medicine, actually, where you often go to a specialist for a particular thing, and they give you this to solve that thing. You need to do this, but they're not looking at the whole you. And I think holistic thinking is much more difficult because it's not linear. But I think the way the world needs people who understand things holistically, and I think part of regenerative thinking is to think holistically. So what I'm trying now to do is to apply perhaps some actual processes and slightly more structured way of helping me deliver that in a way that I think I naturally feel like I want to do anyway. And I tend to get people who, as you said, will say, look, this is a problem that's just wider than this one thing. I think the person you probably need to speak to is Justin, because he can take an overview and look at the whole thing from sustainability through economy, through practicality, through deliverability, and give you a very good steer.
Yeah. It sounds as though there's some kind of unpacking of process to be done, and putting that onto a picture, or something like that. Because as you say, it's maybe people are referring people to you on intuition, and
also people often want a consultant to do a particular thing for them, and so I'm sort of define things as to the what, the how, and the why. And I think it's quite easy to get a consultant to teach you to do the what. What is it you need to do? And there are people who are very specifically expert in particular fields to do that, and the how to do it. But actually the why to do it, I think, is one that's often neglected. Why is it that you want to, particularly when it comes to, one of the things I am quite involved in is discussions around people wanting to run their own wine business, often planting a vineyard, quite a lot, actually nowadays UK based. I think people who are thinking, I either want to, and this is from a tiny scale. I've actually got some very good friends who've just bought a small holding on the Herefordshire-Welsh border, and they have, I think, they haven't bought a vineyard. I think they've bought land in which they're going to plant a vineyard, and they're going to plant 2 hectares and do a tiny project for themselves, and apples and have fruit and livestock, and have a real small holding. So people from that scale up to wealthy people who are looking at the English wine sector and thinking, I'd like to be involved in that. I want to do something that really contributes to that, and advising them and discussing with them how best to do that. And I have one client who planted a vineyard last year, and helping them work out what their motivation was and why it is really that is this a money-making exercise? Is this something that's a dream? Is it a life they want to live? Is it skills they want to acquire, people they want to meet, and helping them understand what their role in that organization will be, and whether that's envisioning what that might look like. I've done that for myself with my own wine project. I've also met people from all scales, all across the world, who've done things for different reasons, and everyone's reasons are different. And I think getting towards the motivations at the beginning, I think, is really important. Otherwise, you can end up going down a road that takes you where you don't really want to be.
Yeah, it's I don't know if it's the sort of double-edged sword of wine, because I always remember years ago Michael Saracen telling me that was the thing that kind of cemented it for him. Was he was in the film industry, and he'd say, if he was going to a film, if you were talking to other people in the film industry, you just talked about film all night, and it was sort of, it was fine, but it was, talking shop. And then he sort of, fell down the wine hole. And then he was going to all of these, wine first type events. And he was like, I'm meeting everyone. I'm meeting people from, from the arts, from the sciences, cops and models, and just about any type of background that you could hope to meet. And it seems as though people can find their why in wine. There's such a broad area, such a diverse area that it attracts an equally diverse group of people.
Very much, and it is one of the highest expressions of human culture, I think, wine. And I'm a slightly a sort of psychology student, and I always like to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow was, I think, Hungarian originated psychologist in the 30s, who came up with this concept that we have to fulfill our most basic needs first for food and shelter and the basics, safety, and then at the next level it's getting into more like comfort and some sort of belief in that safety continuing for more than just a few hours, stability, and then the hierarchy goes onwards and upwards. And at the very top is I think what they call self-actualization, which is an understanding, belief about how the world works and what your place is within it, and to feel comfortable you're doing something self-actualizing in the world is something that many people never quite get to because they're just too busy accumulating the wealth or the status or the things in the levels below that. And I think being someone who reaches a point where you are able to grow grapes and make wine and express yourself somehow through that process and enjoy the process of the making and the sharing and the consuming of that wine, and do that sustainably, is a very nice way to live a life. So I think that's why it's attractive to people, because it has this sort of beacon of appeal that they see that with other people and think, I'd like that. That appeals to me. But yeah, unpicking whether it is that they really want to make money. We all know there's a saying in the wine business, how to make a small fortune in the wine business. Start with a large fortune and buy a winery. And there are lots of examples of people who have quietly basically subsidized their wine business for years and never really told anyone about how much it costs them. And maybe there's a few people listening to this podcast who nodding along going, yep, that's me. And anyone who's starting out needs to recognize that might be the case. But there's plenty of other people who have done well and made a lot of money in the world of wine, and lots of people in between who are actually just really enjoying their lives, making enough money to keep things going. And that's motivation in itself. So yeah, getting to understand that at the beginning of a project, I think, is really important.
Yeah. And I think, you almost hinted at challenge already, which is kind of the next segue. Really, I'd like to take us through. And when you spoke about buying the vineyard in the Roussillon, the challenges of the growing conditions and I think it was hail. You said that the guys were having down there in the Roussillon, but yeah, I just wonder. It would, I think, would be interesting to kind of reflect really on, your time in that project. Really, I think as well. Did you, were you clear on your motivations at that time? And I know that there are some very interesting realizations I think that you've had along the ways. But yeah, I think it's just a reflection on your own journey across that time.
Well, I mean, that's a very good question and rather a personal one, because I do strongly advise people to have a good think about why they're doing something before they do it. Whereas what I did was exactly the opposite, which is go to visit a fantastic wine region, fall in love with it, meet some nice people, and then agree to buy a vineyard without a clue what we were going to do. So actually, and I was talking to the lovely Christelle Guibert, who is, I think, working for the IWSC nowadays, and she's the director of wine there. But some years ago, she's from the Muscadet region, and it must have been 10, 15 years ago. She said, "Look, I'm very, very good friends with a local grower, and he's saying, well, you should buy a vineyard, and if you do, I'll make the wine for you. And but is it a sensible thing to do? I know you've just done it, and is it going well? And should I do it?" And at that point, I said, "Don't think about it. Do you want to do it?" And she went, "Yes." And I said, "Well, don't just do it." She bought a hectare or so. It wasn't going to be her new career. It wasn't a life-changing decision. She had the money to be able to buy the hectare. Well, if you think too hard about it, you'll persuade yourself out of it. Whereas if you want to do it, just do it and then work out how to do it later. So I think there's definitely an argument sometimes for listening to your heart rather than your head, and just going ahead to do something. And that's another lesson I've learned. I used to be quite head dominant in my thinking, and certainly in my professional career. As a buyer for a big supermarket, you've got to justify everything you do. You've got to back things up with numbers, and then you can prove whether you had a good effect or a bad effect. And so everything is very much head focused. You don't buy something on a whim because you love it. At Tesco, I didn't work for Tesco, but the Tesco customer isn't just going to buy the wine that you love because you love it. It's got to look right, be priced right, sit on the shelf at the right point, have a good label, and all those things are kind of more head-based disciplines. But I think, lots of people do live their life a bit more instinctively, and sometimes that's really important to do that. So I suppose that's one thing I have learned. And then in terms of challenges, I really like this expression, which I forget who said it, and I don't want to credit the wrong person, but it's the phrase is, the obstacle is the path.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is sometimes what it means to me, is that when you have a challenge or an obstacle blocking your path, that's sometimes sent there for a reason. And, sometimes say to my wife when she's having trouble with her work and tearing her hair out, and if the job was easy, then anyone could do it. But the reason you're there is because it's difficult, and you're the one who's capable of working your way through this challenge. And sometimes the challenge is the thing that actually is almost sent to teach you a lesson. And there's been a few similar things. Just a good example, the pandemic, massive challenge for all of us. We were due to bottle our wine, I think, 3 weeks after the lockdown was announced. And France announced it slightly differently from us, but it became fairly apparent that we were just not going to be able to bottle our wine. Mm-hmm. And we had a load of club members who were expecting to have a case of wine delivered in 6 weeks' time. And what were we going to do? So we very quickly had to come up with creative ways of, first of all, giving us some cash flow. So we did an urgent email saying, help, please buy some wine from us. We need some money to be able to finance a slightly different way of bottling it. And that was amazingly effective. Everyone was sitting at home bored and suddenly got this plea for help, and we sold a load of wine. And then we had to try and work out a way to get the wine to England to have it bottled here. So we actually didn't bottle our reds. We left them in France because we weren't confident we could ship them to England quickly enough and prepare them right. But the white and the pink that we sell, we shipped to England in bulk and bottled here. And the wine was on sale to people a month after we got the call saying the bottling was cancelled, which is, required an incredible speed. And, when you have a crisis like that, it helps you break through some of the barriers. You just have a sense of urgency and a creativity. And I think everyone felt a sort of surge of creativity when you were forcibly required to constrain yourself. Constraint sometimes makes you creative. And so I kind of quite like challenges because I think they teach you things, and hopefully you remember them afterwards. And I'm lucky enough not to have had too many existential challenges so far in my life. I'm touching wood. But generally when they come along, they're quite useful.
Yeah, and I think it also, as you say, you talk about your wife's work, and as you say, that good example there, it kind of, it shakes people out, who are I think are not there for the long run, because you will only, I agree, you will get to that creative solution, but it takes a lot of effort, doesn't it? It takes a lot of mental effort. It maybe takes researching, maybe takes learning a new skill, maybe, having multiple conversations and kind of synthesizing those. It's not an easy thing. And I totally get that. The obstacle is the way. It forces you to do something different, to pivot, to be better, basically, in order to overcome that. And it's almost, I feel as though, if I've done that in my life, then I'm way less likely to give up on that area then, because it's like, I've now sort of probably elevated myself into a smaller group of people by having that development. And it's like, okay, now that really is my way. That was my test. That was my, that was the fork in the road. And I managed to stay on the path.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's a little bit that there's always good things to find in disasters and problems, and there are people who have much more constrained life circumstances where something terrible really happens, and it's very hard to say that to them at that point. But sometimes you hear about people's stories later on when they tell the story of their lives, and it's sometimes those pivotal moments that actually made the most impact and changed their life the most. And I think it's a good way to look at things that are challenging and not regard them as stressful and always negative. So sometimes you get positives from something that might be seen as a challenge. Yeah,
I do have MW students listening, so I'm guessing that might be something that they can take from that as well. And you mentioning the ashen-faced MW students, I think it's still a thing if my Instagram feed is anything to go by.
Definitely. When I can distinctly remember when I did finally decide to study for the MW, and some of the things that gave me the biggest kick up the arse were having some really bad feedback and going, you're no way near, this is not good. This is actually what makes you go, okay, I need to raise my game. I need to do something about this. And I had a phobia of essays. I got through my whole university career with hardly writing any essays, and then probably wrote more essays in my final exams than I'd written in the whole of the previous year. And didn't do them very well. Wasn't very good at essay writing. And when I studied for the MW, I just thought about this. I've got to write 4 papers in those days, but I don't know, 12, 15 essays over the 4 days. And I can't avoid doing that. I've got to practice. I've got to write 50, 100 essays for practicing. So I thought, I'll just do one every day. And that was the magic that saved me, because I just got up a bit earlier, got to work a bit earlier, turned the paper over, did the next one, wrote the essay, handed it to my friend Neil, who's a fellow who was then an MW and I was not. And he kindly marked it while I had some breakfast, and then came back in and after breakfast to an essay saying C-, must try harder. And the fact that I routinized it and made it something I did every day actually made it not a problem anymore. And I got quite used to writing essays and didn't have the fear anymore. Yeah,
and again, I think that's great advice, because it's still a thing. Again, I think we're sort of bringing in parallels from earlier in the conversation, but it's again people who are studying the MW program. I mean, I'm sure there's stats out there, but they seem to come from a really broad background as well. And I've always spoken with people who've said, I've not written, I didn't write essays in my undergraduate, or there was a lady I was speaking to last year who's a winemaker, and so it's not a core component of her job to write essays about the fermentation and about the wine business, and so it draws people from a lot of areas, but that seems to be and
there's no doubt that wherever you come from, there's no way you can have covered all of the topics to a high level to study for the MW. So I had a very poor. I'd done a decent amount of winemaking, but I'd done very little viticulture. So my whole viticulture paper was really weak. So I really had to focus on studying for that. But the joy is, you've got some people who are viticulturists who just have no idea about the marketing and the sales. It's a complete mystery how bottling happens and how blending happens, and you have to do a lot of learning. And as you say, if you're not trained in an English-speaking essay writing way of thinking, you do have to learn how to do that. It's very learnable, but you have to put a lot of time and energy into learning how to do it well. And I think the people who do best are the people who learn quickly how you need to write and structure answers. Sometimes people take a long time to get the message, and other times people go, okay, right, now I see what I'm required to do, and then they learn that skill quite quickly. But practicing writing essays and practicing writing for fast tasting notes has a big effect. I 3 months before I took the exam, I'd been ignoring all the people who told me I had to write a grid and have a systematized way of writing notes. And then I finally wasn't doing very well in my test papers. So I just said, right, I'm going to try and do this. Yeah. And for about 2 weeks, I tried doing it with a grid, and it seemed to work better. So I carried on. And then when I took the exam, I did it, and it worked fairly well. One paper didn't go well, but the other two were quite good. So it definitely, well, it's perhaps it's the challenge again. When you really have a challenge, it forces you to rethink. And then that rethinking sometimes is the solution to success.
Yeah. And it's, personal growth, if you just as does happen, as I know I've done in my own life as well, when you just are so stubborn and you just refuse to change, then that's a sort of a nice side effect as well, isn't it? Long term, that you will grow as well. But actually, I do want to pick up on something you said as we sort of look towards closing. But I would like to get into a little bit more, what I call kind of the service, or something that you do that's a little bit different, I would say, and kind of how you show up to your clients, let's say. But you used a word earlier, a phrase earlier, the wine club, which having been in Oregon earlier on this month, I heard a lot at the Oregon Wine Symposium, and meeting a lot of tasting room staff and winemakers, and spending time on their direct to consumer channel, and all of the sort of lectures and great learning opportunities around that. There was so much talk around wine clubs and wine club members, and the churn rates of wine clubs, and keeping people engaged, and what are we doing with our wine club pickups, and how are we making those in a event a sort of a thing. But I would just love to get an insight into what that means for you in terms of a wine club, and maybe even relating it to the knowledge I'm sure you have of wine clubs and how they work in the States versus how they kind of work in the UK.
Definitely. Well, look, it's I've been lucky enough in my career to be exposed to various different ways of thinking, and obviously, having worked in supermarkets. Little anecdote from my early days. I worked in South Africa as a winemaker, and on a project called Jacana, which only existed for about 2 years. But I very distinctly remember seeing the tractor drive up with a trailer of grapes, and first of all going and picking up a bunch and smelling it and eating some of the grapes and going, these are really tasty. And then seeing them crushed, seeing them piped into the tank, and then every day after that going in and hand plunging the tank, and that contact with the fermenting wine and the smells and the sights and the dawn across the Devon Valley and the red soil of South Africa and the beautiful mountains are so seared in my mind. I went on and did a few other things, and then I think it was 2 or 3 years later that I actually joined the Safeway wine buying team. And I didn't have responsibility for South Africa, but it turns out that the South Africa buyer had quite independently bought that first wine that we'd made in South Africa. And so I saw it come through the warehouse doors onto the shelves of the shop. And the big impactful moment was going into a shop and just looking at the fixture and seeing what people did, and having 30, 40 people walk past and just pick up whatever was on offer on the middle shelf and ignore the top shelf of South Africa. So Kumala or something was on the middle shelf at $4.49, reduced to $3.49. They put that in their basket, and they ignored the Jacana Pinotage on the top shelf at $8.99. And it finally started moving when we knocked £2 off it, which I don't think was a planned promotion. I think it was just to get it moving. And then it stopped again when it went back to $8.99. And I got very, very depressed, actually, because I knew what was inside that bottle. Yeah. I knew what it tasted like. I knew what it was like, where the vineyard was. I knew how it had been made. All of that information was sort of lost when the customer just saw a label and did or didn't pick it up. And it only would have come across if they'd picked the bottle up, taken it home, read the back label, opened the bottle, and gone, okay, I've got a tiny fragment of that knowledge and information has now reached me as a consumer. And so I've been obsessed most of my sort of selling life in trying to get through to the end consumer the magic of how the wine started. And so as soon as we started making our own wine, I knew very quickly from looking at the economics that we were never going to make any money if we made our wine with our costs, added a small margin for us, and then sold it to a distributor who sold it to a retailer who sold it to a customer. Because that way around, we just couldn't make enough to make it worthwhile doing. The only real way to make it worth doing was sell it direct to people ourselves. And partly as a result of that, I've taught myself a certain amount about communicating with people who you want to buy from, who you want to buy from you regularly. But I had the great joy of working for Tony Laithwaite for 3 years after Waitrose. And Tony's an absolutely lovely and inspiring man who created his own small wine club project that grew into a monster because he was in the right place at the right time to help the Sunday Times develop a wine club that suddenly just took off. But his special skill is to be able to communicate in a human way to ordinary folk who are not wine experts about why it is they should buy this wine. He's just really, really good at describing and writing about wine, and then building a relationship with those people. That means they carry on and trust what he has to say. And he's probably no longer doing any frontline writing. Maybe occasionally, once or twice a year, they wheel him out to write about wine. But he's got a culture of people at Laithwaite who are just very, very good at describing something in an enthusiastic way. So I learned a lot from that. And Tony said to me, he said, look, if you sell 100 people a case of wine in year one, however good a salesperson writer you are, if you communicate again with them in year two and say, please buy a case of wine this year, you'll be doing damn well if you get 40 of them, 50 of them to buy a case of wine from you in year two. Because the others, they may well have liked it, but they're probably just busy when they get the email. They're probably intending to, but don't get around to it. And, you could have sold 80 if you'd really, really worked hard. But he said, if you can get 100 people to join a wine club, whereby they will get a case of wine, unless they actually go, do you know what, I don't want it this year, then 90 of them will happily take their case of wine for next year. And the next year, 82 will keep going. And then you find a few new ones. And if you keep them happy and you keep them in the tent, then they will stay loyal customers for years. And that had a big impact on me. And I don't know when it was, 10 years ago, maybe a little more, we changed the way our offer worked from just a sort of once a year mailing to our customer base to saying, hey, why don't you actually join the wine club? And we had amazingly good retention rates. I mean, I think we were up at 97% of people keeping and taking their case. I think now it's still in the mid 90s, which is industry leading. I mean, I know in most places 75 or 80% of people keeping their wine club case a year would be regarded as really good. And what I've sort of taught myself is, I guess, how to keep those people entertained, amused, engaged, enthusiastic by communicating well with them, and then by offering something above what the ordinary customer gets. So our wine club members, they get 20% discount from all our prices, which is quite a significant amount. And the idea of them not being a wine club member and then wanting to buy some rosé and having to pay the full price sort of horrifies them. So they buy their loyal case a year from us, and then benefit from our 20% off prices. But we also invite them to harvest weekends. So last year was actually 20 years since we bought the first vineyard. We decided to make a big thing of our harvest weekend, and we had 35 people come out to a very nice. We took over the whole hotel at Riberac in Bellestar. They've got a Michelin star restaurant, and we had a fabulous weekend centering around a picking and stomping day, which finishes with this lovely dinner in the hotel restaurant. And those people also are going to buy that wine, that barrel that we made, because they literally have had their feet in it, and they have their names on the back of the bottle. And we've done it 3 or 4 times before, and they've always been really good fun connecting weekends where those people become really, when they talk about us to their friends, you can see their eyes sparkling because they can remember the fun that they had. So that's what really motivates me. And I think that's what the opportunity of a wine club does for you, is allows you to bring people closer and to get them to feel some of that enthusiasm for the sights and sounds and smells of the region where you're making a wine, even if they never visit and they just get that through reading mailings and looking at videos and things like that.
I absolutely love it. I mean, literally, my head is sort of buzzing with all of the firstly, all of the positive things I'm hearing. I just think that thinking differently, really, really going step by step, and you're not writing to people who are in the wine trade. You're writing to people who, I believe, over the course of time have just grown to see wine as a commodity. They only see it in a shelf on offer, probably, as you say. What's on the shopping list? We're going to get some bread, we're going to get some jam, we're going to get some wine, and I think anything can be much more than that. But I just think that wine is just, for me, it's the best. It is just got so many of those elements, and you described so many of them there: the travel, the camaraderie, the fun, linking it to local culture. I'm still yet to find an ugly wine region around the world. Happy to keep looking, but wine regions are just naturally very beautiful. We might stick some ugly structures on them, but they in and of themselves are just gorgeous places, no matter where you go around the world. And there are just so many hooks to bring people in.
And the food culture, generally, you eat well if you go to a wine region. And, there are many such examples. And, it's a lovely world to be in. And I can see why it's so attractive to people. But I think one of the things that we do wrong is, and there's a lot of talk about this at the moment, is I think our wine education process is very focused on learning the facts and then being told that telling the facts to customers is the way to get those customers engaged. And it isn't. It just isn't. And someone described this to me, that it's a bit like, imagine a BMW salesman saying to the customer who comes in, oh, this latest, if I say 7 Series, that probably shows my dating. I probably haven't had a 7 Series for 20 years, but this latest 7 Series BMW, it's 32% rubber, 16% steel, 5% glass, 3% plastic. What relevance is that to most people? The exact great composition of a particular
and the stereo was made in China, in Guangzhou, and the tires were made in Italy, and giving such a and
the sulfur content of the rubber is specifically because it comes from volcano. Not interesting. When I drive it, I will be safe. I will be excited, and my neighbour's going to be jealous. And that's what's going to make you buy a BMW versus another car. And I think it's features rather than benefits, isn't it? So you describe the features too much without describing the benefits. And I think we do that a lot in wine. And I think communicating a bit more enthusiastically the things around wine, the cultural stuff around wine, and the regions and the places where it's made is a much more persuasive way of getting someone excited about a wine than trying to talk about whether is it cranberries or is it raspberries?
Yeah.
I'm not even consistent in saying it's the same. If you give me the same wine twice in a row, I won't give you the same fruit, and most people won't either. And it's kind of we're a bit obsessed about the wrong things in wine education.
Absolutely love it. And again, I have got to stop myself because, we have come to the end of today, but I feel as though that in and of itself could be a very interesting starting point for a future conversation. But I just, want to say a huge thank you because the time has absolutely flown by, and really enjoyed hearing about the project, and hearing and getting to know you, and hearing your thoughts on all different elements of the wine world. And I think very much what I take, and what I always try to do as well is saying, okay, how do we get better? Not to put down what's currently happening, because that doesn't help anybody, does it? It's like, okay, what about trying this, or what about trying that? And ultimately, if we can get more people to come into the wine world, then it's going to be sort of positive for everyone. And really, in closing, I just invite you to share your coordinates. Really, I know that you've got a website for your vineyard project. You've got a mailing list. You've got courses. You've got all sorts of things coming up. So where are some of the places where people can track you down once they've listened to this episode?
Yes, well, look, we'd be very delighted if anyone who listens wants to visit domainofthebee.com. So domain with an E of the bee.com, which is our website, and join the mailing list. We do send out amusing monthly emails and occasional emails trying to sell you something, but we don't focus too much on that. We try and keep you entertained and amused. Yeah. And that's a good place to find out about this project. It's still in conception. It's maybe a year away from being launched as a sort of I've got to raise the money first, and we might do some crowdfunding. But if that sounds interesting, go there. I'd love you, if you're at all involved in the kind of professional side of wine, particularly vineyard side, to go to regenerativeviticulture.org and just join the mailing list and understand what's happening in the world of Regen. And then if you want to know specifically quite a lot more about Regen, I do teach a course which is at West Dean College in Sussex. There is a course in June. It's a 2-day course, and it's about the introduction to regenerative viticulture. And it's in, I think, June 22nd to 24th. So if you go to the West Dean website, if you Google West Dean College, you'll find it. And there's so many courses you can do there. It's incredible. So almost the best way is to search for the tutor. Search for Justin Howard-Sneyd among the tutors, and you'll find that actually 2 courses I'm running there. And do come along and join us there. And do connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to. If you're in the professional side of wine, just drop me a note to say who you are and how you heard about me, and we can pick up the conversation there.
A massive thanks to today's guest, Justin Howard-Sneyd, Master of Wine. Visit domainofthebee.com, the link is below, to learn more about the project and to join the mailing list. And why not reach out to Justin to let him know what you thought of the episode and follow up on the themes we discussed. Next time on the Mosaic of Wine Series 2 in episode 581, I'll be speaking with Kelsey Glasser, owner of Arden Restaurant in Portland, Oregon. Subscribe to Interpreting Wine to be alerted when that episode goes live. And if you're not already, why not follow along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter X, and hello@interpretingwine.com. See you soon.